para iniciar esta sesión número 6. Y nuestra primera presentación sería de Edmund Smith. Y voy a dar la palabra a Edmund. Edmund, it's now your mic.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I hope I'm coming through okay. This isn't a system I'm familiar with, and I really do wish that I was there with you in Seville, as I'm sure you can imagine. One of the challenges of writing this paper was not quite knowing where it will fit in the overall arc of the conference, having been unable to get out of teaching the past couple of days. So I'm hoping that this will build successfully on some of the discussions you've had already, and especially link in with William Pettigrew's presentation from this morning. So the focus of this presentation is on the after effects of the Trade with Africa Act from 1697, which I'm sure William probably represented within the longer chronology of institutional change and political change in Britain. That in 1697 led to the facility whereby independent traders could legally participate in the British transatlantic slave trade alongside and supplementing, but also in opposition to the Royal African Company. So what I'm interested in is trying to explain the different enterprising approaches, the different institutional approaches of individual independent traders, and to reflect on how this sudden liberalization of the trade made it possible for them to undertake and participate in slightly different ways, but also to question how much some of these traders just followed the same patterns of exchange and contact, while others perhaps pushed the trade in other directions. So the sudden opening of the lucrative trade generated rapid interest from independent traders, and this is something I'm sure all of you will know, contributing to a rapid increase in the number of voyages from Britain after the Act came into force in 1698, which hopefully you can now see the next slide. As you can see here, while the RAC's participation remained stable during this surge of interest, averaging 9.8 voyages per year between 1698 and 1702, independent traders sent 49.6 voyages per year during the same period, with a peak of 97 voyages in a single year sent in 1701 to West Africa. During this period, the RAC competed not only with established African traders, including figures who had petitioned for Parliament to pass the Trade with Africa Act, but also a large number of speculative participants who sought an easy profit from the newly open trade, but who, either due to initial failure or the promise of richer opportunities elsewhere, did not become regular participants in the trade after this early bubble burst. Thus, from 1703 onwards, as discussed in detail throughout this presentation, independent traders continue to outstrip the RAC in terms of voyages, although their average number of voyages declined from the early peak, with 29.7% sent on average, 29.7 voyages sent on average between this point and 1711. During the same period, the RAC's share of the trade briefly rallied, increasing to 17 voyages in 1704 and 5, before declining to only 2 by 1611, averaging 11.2 voyages per year across this 8-year period. As this suggests, there was certainly capacity for expanding British participation in the transatlantic slave trade, but the effectiveness of independent traders in connecting the trade with new markets, their flexibility vis-a-vis the company, and the willingness of new entrants to operate beyond the traditional geographies of RAC activity allowed them to surpass the scale and range of the corporation's 17th century activities. The shift from speculative but less experienced independent engagement in the slave trade between 1699 and 1702 and the adoption of more consistent practice after 1703 can be identified here. Here, the total number of captives transported by British slave traders mostly tracks the number of voyages, but there is a less significant decline after 1702, with the number of captives remaining close to the 1701 peak despite this. This is explained, as suggested above, by the changing practices of independent traders, who after many speculative participants chose not to send further voyages after this initial surge, instead adopted practices that increased the number of captives transported per voyage. Thus, while the average number of voyages between 1703 and 1711 were less than a third of the 1701 peak, the number of captives carried by independent traders each year averaged 5,664 individuals, or 41.4% of the 13,000 captives transported in 1701. As seen in this figure, this pattern reflected changes in the number of captives transported per voyages that decreased rapidly during the immediate aftermath of the Trade with Africa Act, with independent voyages carrying on average 189 captives between 1698 and 1702, but then increased and stabilized as the number of voyages declined, with the number of captives carried per voyage averaging 228 between 1703 and 1711. This pattern can be explained in part by a glut in the market for slave purchases in Africa caused by the surge in voyages detailed above, but is already also indicative of speculative traders seeking to utilize ships and practices that were not suited to the trade, leading to 70 voyages reaching their destination with less than 100 captives between 1698 and 1702, while there were only 26 voyages as small as this across the entire 1703 to 1711 period. Yet, despite the increase in numbers of captives carried by independent voyages in the latter part of this period, the average number of captives carried by independent voyages never reached the scales of those common with the RAC before 1698, which had averaged 338 captives per voyage. However, there is little to suggest that independent traders ever sought to do so, with smaller ships more capable of catering to changing market conditions in Africa and America remaining more popular with independent traders. Thus, while the RAC did retain a high number of captives per voyage, at 247 across the period after 1698 than did independent traders, this represented a change in practice that was likely enforced, decreasing the profitability of individual voyages despite maintaining the same costs for larger ships and the maintenance of forts that had, in the 17th century, been sustained in part by the transportation of larger volumes of captives per voyage. Instead, as we can see in the latter stages of this period under consideration, the RAC struggled and the scale of their operations rapidly declined in the early 1710s as independent traders took more and more control of the trade. The process by which independent traders outdid the RAC included then their adoption of practices that focused on sending numerous but smaller voyages that could be more adaptive, rather than modeling their practices on RAC efforts to send large ships and dominate individual markets. As these two figures show, during the early surge in participation in the slave trade, independent traders struggled to obtain large numbers of captives for transportation, with the smallest voyages carrying only 52, 9, and 39 captives in 1701, 1701, and 1702, respectively. However, after this chaotic early period, this surge, this bubble of independent slave trading, independent slave traders who remained active adopted practices whereby the very large ships that had categorized the earlier RAC voyages were replaced with smaller, cheaper vessels that could more easily adapt to market conditions on both sides of the Atlantic. By 1704, it was increasingly rare for independent slave voyages to transport less than 100 captives during each voyage, and the average number of captives transported per voyage stabilized at between 200 and 300, even as the number of captives per RAC voyage fluctuated and declined during the same period. Comparing these two figures, therefore, means that despite sending fewer voyages, the variation in size between the largest and smallest voyages of the RAC and the size of the ships employed were greater for much of this period than those of the largest and smallest independent traders, despite the latter having no shared organization. This suggests that this is further indicated in the examination of destinations by RAC voyages that are represented in this graph. And here we can see that despite the corporation's long history engaging in the trade, they had not by the early 17th century adopted either regular practices regarding the size of their ships, nor matched these to the demands of specific markets in Africa or the Americas. Conversely, independent traders were more likely to send large numbers of smaller but potentially more efficient vessels that could obtain larger numbers of captives in Africa for transportation at more efficient rates. Leading us back to the fairly standard questions around topics like this. regarding transaction costs and enterprise. This issue of standardization versus adaptation might also be seen when we compare this chart here showing the principal places of purchase for RAC voyages, which, as I will hope you will agree, is fairly chaotic. There's not a clear pattern here or strategy, it would seem. And this would compare potentially unfavorably with this graph indicating the destinations of independent voyages during the same period. One thing to note would be that during the surge in the slave trade in the 1700-1701 period is the expansion of trades towards the Bight of Biafra and West Central Africa, which was also something that we see happening somewhat in the RAC voyages graph. But this quickly disappears as the main destination for independent traders and replaced especially by the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin as destinations as they avoid the direct trade into Cape Coast Castle, which obviously the RAC continues to dominate, and instead focus on the region nearby. This, I think, allows us to recognize the connections between these organizations, and I'll detail this more when I look at their networks in a few minutes, but also indicates the effectiveness of independent traders, perhaps, of breaking into new markets that perhaps in the past would have been deemed trapped or too difficult. If we shift our focus from Africa to the Atlantic, the destinations of these voyages, between 1695 and 1711, the RAC and independent traders both sent voyages to 15 different destinations, and the vast majority of the voyages were intended to reach similar markets in the Caribbean, where they would be competing with each other. The RAC did trade in some locations in small numbers that independent traders did not reach, such as Savannah and Basseterre, but these were not large markets, and each location only received a single voyage from the company during this period. The most popular destinations for the RAC and independent traders were alike were Antigua, Barbados, and Jamaica, while the RAC also sought to maintain a presence in St. Nevis, even as independent traders turned towards new markets in Britain's North American colonies, including Maine, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia. In total, during this period, the RAC sent 132 voyages to these destinations, while independent traders were responsible for 699 voyages. And we can see the difference between these destinations of RAC voyages versus the destinations of independent traders by number of voyages as represented here. As we can see, much like the destinations in Africa, this is perhaps a question of chaos versus stability. And also the simple volume of trades allow independent traders to really swamp markets in places like Jamaica with a number of voyages that the RAC simply can't compete with. It's important to note that while there was stabilization in number of voyages to specific markets, and especially interest in Jamaica, there was less interest comparatively with Antigua and St. Nevis, small maxed out markets where the RAC had long established patterns of exchange and interaction that were more difficult to break into. Conversely, there was much more willingness by independent traders to try out markets in North America, suggesting again the possible adaptation of these enterprising individuals, but also a recognition of the way in which many of these traders were already participating in North Atlantic trading networks, to which they could add the additional loop of the transatlantic slave trade into their web. As we can see from this table, which represents cumulative data from the previous two graphs, we can see that St. Nevis remained a destination mostly attractive to the RAC, and considering the small size of the island, this is not surprising. Antigua was targeted only by independent traders from London, not those from Bristol, Liverpool, or elsewhere, alongside the RAC. Barbados, the longest established slave colony in the British Caribbean, was most contested, with the RAC remaining a strong presence despite interest from independent traders from London and from Barbados itself. That being said, though, Jamaica was the main market the main target market for both London independent traders during the initial expansion of trade, who were later joined by a considerable number of Bristol traders, who by 1711 were sending roughly the same number of voyages to the island as London traders each year. There are a number of reasons why Jamaica was so attractive that I'm sure all of you know, so I won't go into those. And I think it's perhaps more notable to recognize the focus of independent traders from London, especially towards North America, where London traders contributed to the establishment of a regular slave trading connection between West Africa and North America, a market that was developed by a discrete and tightly interconnected community of traders, working especially with the Houdnich and Brooke firm, who were able to corner this emerging market in ways that were quite unique during this period, and also recognized the importance of existing trading networks of which these two individuals were part. If we consider how these destinations reached over time, we can also see the vast contribution of London traders to the initial surge in 1701 and 1702, but over time, the surge from London traders and Caribbean traders declined in comparison to the increasing growth of Bristol slave traders in this particular market, a trajectory that would continue into the following decades and really come to define the structure of British trade during this period. If we now narrow our focus further from cities and voyages towards individuals to the individuals who owned and captained ships taking part in the British slave trade during this period, we can see how this structure came to pass. As you can see in this graph, on average, owners and captains took part in 2.52 voyages between 1703 and 1711. However, this presents an unclear picture of participation in the slave trade, suggesting that it's more of a regular pattern than was really the case, and the vast majority of participants during this period actually only took part in a single voyage before withdrawing from the trade, at least until the end of this decade. Instead, therefore, what we can see here is a core of very, very active owners and captains who sat within a network that could draw on a large number of speculative investors and inexperienced captains who they were able to use effectively in establishing these new trading routes. And it perhaps shifts the focus towards, if we think about institutional questions, from the role of the RAC as a means of bringing together individuals and sharing information and developing strategies for affecting this trade, towards the idea of clusters within the more independent network who undertook that similar responsibility that corporations are often seen to do, especially during the early period, as sinks of information and capital and various forms of communication. What did this mean then for the shape of the trade? Individual investors, as we can see, pooled money with experienced investors, allowing for more experienced investors with more expertise to draw on the capital of others, despite limiting, while also limiting their risk of the particular trade. On average, over the course of this period, each voyage involved 3.68 participants, usually with a single captain and one or more owners of the ship. And this is represented in this graph chart. Within these numbers, and as you can see, the typical numbers would be at least a captain and owner, or a captain and two owners, or a captain and three owners. These created small nexuses and networks within each voyage that were connected by investment across different voyages, creating networks of elite separate traders that Pettigrew has identified under the term elite separate traders that included Richard Harris, Robert Haysham, Isaac Milner, Humphrey Morris, and Peter Pagan, who he describes as representing the unofficial leaders of the separate traders' political operation. And this is a distinct network, but we can also see collaborating traders and common links across links to the Caribbean and North America, such as the Houdnich and Brooke nexus that I mentioned already, and also quite a distinct and important separate network of Bristol traders who increasingly connected with these existing networks and voyages in order to facilitate their entrance to the trade. Which brings us to this network of the investors who took part in the slave trade during the 1695 to 1711 period. Obviously, this doesn't include RAC investors as a distinct group, but it's all the owners who participated in independent voyages. One of the things that we can see here is the density of the network around people like Huguenot and Brooke and James Waite and Edward Searle and others towards the right-hand side of the graph, who participated in many voyages, often alongside the same groups of individuals, with investors pouring their capital time and time again, even as they relied on different captains for individual voyages. And there was a quick churn in the types of individuals that they were employing. That being said, if we take the network as a whole, the role of ship captains in directing the structure of the slave trade actually becomes very important, especially as we start to consider the innovative practices of new entrants to the trade. And this is especially the case in connecting different strands of involvement and contributing to the transmission of practice and knowledge of routes. Among the owners and captains of the independent voyages, 18 individuals can be identified, for example, as people who also served as captains on RAC voyages. These were vital interlocutors between the existing company in the 17th century trade and the new traders undertaken within this independent environment. However, these were not the only links with the incumbent company, and a further 28 independent traders can be identified as former investors in the RAC, while 13 were willing to work alongside the company, shipping cargo on the same ships as the corporation. But with all that said, I want to focus on two specific parts of this network, which are these on the screen now, specifically around that of Captain Edmund Saunders and Joseph Way. And here we can see the way that these individuals acted as interlocutors, connecting new traders and new participants in the transatlantic slave trade by connecting and sharing knowledge and experience across what are often considered quite distinct operations of the RAC, the London independent traders, the Bristol independent traders, and so forth. However, even as we consider the importance of their position within the network in connecting these groups, we're also challenged to consider the limitations of these connections. And somebody like Joseph Way, who's vitally important for working with many, many different captains, as you can see here, also owes a lot of his connection into the main group in London through Captain John Normanton, which problematizes some of the ways in which we might consider owners as investors versus captains as workers in ways that I think people are aware of, but that we could push more in understanding these institutional formations. Although mostly absent from political debates in London, therefore, captains served an important role in shaping the practices and structure of the slave trade between 1703 and 1711, serving as important transmitters of experience between established slave traders and new entrants. A comparison between their respective degree, so that's the number of connections they have within the network, and their between a centrality, which is a measure of their importance within the network, can be used to identify the role of captains as interlocutors. In this table here, the incidence of captains in relatively higher positions when ranked for the centrality of their position within the network, rather than by their number of relationships, indicates this trend. For instance, Captain Joseph Martin was the most central node of the network, despite only having the 8th highest number of relationships. Similarly, Captain Edmund Saunders, who I showed you in the previous network, was the 10th most central figure, while only the 20th most connected, while Captains Roger Francis, William Kenner, and John Normanton were the 15th, 16th, and 17th most central nodes, despite ranking 22nd, 56th, and 69th in terms of their degree. Comparing the difference between the rankings of members across the cohort in terms of their degree and between a centrality highlights this trend. People with experience captaining slave trading voyages increased their rank by an average of 7.16 when graded between a centrality rather than degree, and the position of owners without this experience fell by a corresponding amount. For captains with experience working for the RAC, there was even more dramatic a rise, and they rose 12.22 places, demonstrating how their position within the network of participants considerably outweighed their relatively low number of direct relationships. For people in this cohort who had previously invested in the RAC, however, the average actually changes by minus 7.21, indicating that while their involvement took place alongside a large number of other people, they were not contributing as much to connecting the different participants in the slave trade. So they were useful for bringing in capital and establishing investment, but perhaps not so useful at sharing ideas and new information. This trend is important because it shows how captains like acted as points of connection between otherwise less connected clusters of participants in slave voyages. If we shift finally to a focus on Bristol specifically, we can see that Bristol captains rose more than anybody else according to this measure, increasing 18.39 positions higher in neutrality than by degree. While participants in London, participants in London were on average 6.69 places lower when ranked by the same parameters. This indicates the extent to which London traders were likely to invest alongside a narrower, more familiar network, while owners and captains from Bristol were more likely to rely on a wider network of partners in order to participate in the slave trade and establish new relationships in ways that weren't as important for the London compatriots. As we know, Bristol would, over the coming decades, catch up with London in terms of the North American market, sending 102 voyages to the region between 1705 and 1730. Liverpool would send 10, and London 105. Charleston and York River in South Carolina and Virginia were the most popular destinations in the region, receiving 49 and 82 voyages respectively during this period, indicating this ongoing shift in interest and the ongoing role of these pre-existing networks of communication exchange in directing how the British slave trade took place. So I'll just conclude by once again highlighting the importance of individual traders as interlocutors, and also the importance in recognizing that while the Trade with Africa Act allowed for the liberalization and expansion of the British slave trade, the actual practices and ways in which people participated were closely linked in many respects to the existing parameters of the RAC, but removing many of the trappings in terms of expensive overheads such as larger ships and payment for forts, which forces us to question how much these can compare in terms of their simple innovation or entrepreneurial activities, and instead try to consider them as different parts or different types of participants in imperial and commercial expansion from Britain during the late 17th and early 18th century. And with that, I'll end and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Edmund. Our next paper is by Edgar Pereira from the Universidad de Coimbra.
Hi, everyone, in this amphitheater and back home, or wherever you are watching remotely. Thank you, Manuel, for making me feel less lonely in this big white table. Otherwise, I would be by myself. Like everyone before me, I have to thank the conveners of this fascinating event, Jonatán, Manuel, and Pedro. When Pedro approached me last spring to invite me to come to this conference, my gut reaction was to say no, because I'm not an historian or a student of the Asiento de Negros. I did my PhD on certain asientos, or to be more precise, assentos, as we say in Portuguese. I'm sort of a specialist, or someone who's trying to become a specialist on forms of government outsourcing, government contracts, tax farming, the forerunners of what we would call public-private partnerships, but not in the whole Hispanic monarchy per se, but more specifically in the Portuguese crown domains and the Portuguese empire. So, and I always feel like I need to explain this, especially when I come to Spain, or every time I go to an archive in Spain. I'm not working on Judeo-conversos portugueses in Castile or in the Indies de Castilla. I'm working on asentistas who operate first and foremost from Lisbon and from there to the domains of the Portuguese crown, be it Portuguese and Portuguese New Christians, as a lot of them are, but also Italians. We've talked a great deal about Italians, but also people from the Netherlands, north and south, people from the country of Germany in the present day. So, but having said that, I feel like I have a contribution to make to the discussions we're having here. I need to give a previous disclaimer before I go on for my presentation, which is, it's undisputable, I'm not going to deny it, that my presentation compared to some others that have been given before is fairly Eurocentric, is focused mainly on white, affluent, powerful males, probably cisgender, a lot of them. So I don't want you to think that I am advocating a return to this very old-fashioned way of conducting history. But I think it's also important to look at the institutional trappings and the formal mechanisms to regulate and to derive revenue from the transatlantic slave trade and the trade with Atlantic Africa, because it is important, because it allows us to focus on the gainers of these activities, these abhorrent activities, as Filippo was putting this morning, as well as to acknowledge exactly what sort of mechanisms allowed these gainers, which are both the crown, as the state in progress, right? The state that is under formation, but also the economic elites that benefited from the suffering of others. And as I said, I will not be focusing on the Asiento de Negros per se. What I'm going to be looking is at the sort of analogous institutions that the Portuguese developed long before the Asiento de Negros was created, that at a certain point overlapped with them. We have had mentions of these contratos before, but then they also have an history that stretches beyond the period of the Asientos Portugueses, so from 1595 to 1640. So what I'm going to be doing here is to give a brief sort of crash course, a cursory overview over these sorts of institutions, how they were outlined. So in the end, it's a bit of a story of how Portuguese monarchical capitalism devised mechanisms to engage powerful and affluent capitalists to regulate and to exploit the transatlantic slave trade. And without further ado, I am going to start with the actual content part of the presentation. Whoops. Okay. Here we go. So in the first slide, you already have examples of the sort of legal document that I will be focusing on in this presentation. There's an example of a Cape Verde tax farm contract and the example of a provisioning monopoly contract, not for Spanish America as a whole, but for Maranhão. So a part of Portuguese America, considering, of course, that Brazil and Estado do Maranhão were actually two separate sort of colonial districts of the Portuguese Empire in Portuguese America. So, as I said, what am I going to be telling you about today? I will be giving you this sort of overview and outline of the history of the Portuguese government contracts that pertain to the Atlantic Africa and to the transatlantic slave trade, for the most part in the 17th century. I will not go beyond this period into the 1700s. But we can discuss, maybe if you guys want, a little bit more about the subsequent periods. I will be looking at the contracts and the revenue farms that were awarded through general and temporary partnerships, even if some of these temporary partnerships could last for several years and not just one individual voyage or a couple of voyages, as is the case with some certain trading voyages. So the so-called sociedades e companhias. I will not be focusing on chartered companies. Of course, some of these contracts were granted to corporations, to this collective entity. So I'll not be talking about the Companhia de Cacheu, for example, which has the Asiento at the turn of the 18th century. And of course, I'm going to try to make connections between these Portuguese contracts with the Asiento de Negros. So I intend to compare and contrast them, to disentangle them, and then to entangle them back together again. And as I said, these Portuguese contracts preceded for a few hundreds of years the Asiento de Negros. We start to see them pop up in the 15th century. During the 1595, 1640, and then 1695 and 1701, they overlapped, as I will explain. And then after these periods, they continued and they had their own trajectory, their own evolution. Actually, these types of administrative solutions and this type of mechanisms to engage affluent, wealthy, economic elites in processes of state-making, of beefing up the administrative capacity of polities, and in terms of empire building, actually have a very, very long history that stretches back way beyond the early modern period. And actually it goes back to the classic Roman period, through what we called the Societates Publicanorum, which is actually a legal institute that is the forerunner of a lot of these asientos and contratos. And they were utilized in ancient Rome, and then through the revival of Roman law in the early modern period, we see them popping up again. And even before, already in the Middle Ages, of course, they were also utilized, and then they were employed again in the mid-15th century, and then 16th century, and then onwards. So these are the legal institutes that allowed general partnerships to operate tax farms, government concessions, which included salt pans or mines, for example, but also monopolies. And we see also certain legal figures that we can observe during the functioning of the Asiento. Jonathan, you were presenting this morning and you were talking about these different agents that operate within the umbrella of the Asiento, and I was recognizing a lot of these figures from what I've read from Roman law. So the figure of the executive manager, the magistrati, or the partner that puts his signature on the contract and represents the consortium of investors in the public auctions, the manceps. We also see similar ways of organizing the functioning of these enterprises with public tenders, where you have either ascending or descending bids, where people are tendering to get these contract offering what they find to be the most advantageous terms that the crown is going to crown, or in this case, the Roman Senate or the Roman Empire are going to accept or not. And then also the figures of the bondsmen and the collateral, the fianzas and the fiadores. All of this we can already find in these early periods. As I said, centuries before the period that I'm going to cover. Then moving into the sort of, even before the early modern period chronologically, but sort of the foundational stages for these type of interactions. When we look at the contracts that the Portuguese crown, or even before the Portuguese crown, when Henry the Navigator, son of the king, was given exclusive rights over these voyages of discovery and over settling and trading in the West African coast, we already see that we have exclusive rights over the launching of trading voyages to particular areas and to oversee all sorts of commercial operations in crown factories, or also rights to deal exclusively with certain commodities are being awarded to private entrepreneurs who maintain some sort of political and economic relation with these grandes or even the crown itself. Of course, both Henry the Navigator and then Prince Juan, who comes afterwards, and then the crown later, were not sort of farming out or outsourcing these type of activities wholesale in their entirety. There was the principle that the crown would retain operational control over the most lucrative, but not only the most lucrative, the most risk-proof or the most guaranteed investment. So for example, on the Gold Coast in São Jorge de Mina, El Mina as you probably know it, the crown very rarely, if ever, transfer the rights to manage and to exploit this activity to private entrepreneurs. And also, during this phase of voyages of exploration, of reconnaissance of the West African coast, we also see these contracts where a private entrepreneur for a certain period of time is held accountable to recognize a specific stretch of African coast. So every year, the entrepreneur needs to send voyages that are going to advance the line of acknowledgement, so to speak, further south and southeast, and essentially take care of the costs of exploration, reconnaissance, local detecting what sort of economic resources justify a more substantial economic engagement. The opening of new markets and then the establishment of trading stations and of relations possibly peaceful, but also violent if it proves lucrative to have more bellicose interactions with autochthonous populations. So this is the first example of these type of contracts that precede the sort of public-private partnerships, to use an anachronistic term, that resemble the Asiento. So when we consider sort of standard economic theory about this type of interactions, why would the crown or a duke, a son of a king, would engage in franchising these rights, these economic resources to third parties? Well, on the one hand, to balance the operational deficit that quite often the crown felt when it came to trade and to settle in these places. So there were significant costs involved with setting up shop, so to speak, at these places. There was a huge amount of fixed costs with infrastructures, maintain them, build them, operate them, but also to pay a wide array of individuals that serve the crown there. We're talking about military personnel, but also the bureaucracy and, of course, the clergy, because the Portuguese had a religious ecclesiastical patronage and so had to ensure that the activities of the clergy were also subsidized by the royal treasury. Also, because these concessions are based on the payment of lump sums, so there is a negotiation between the crown and the entrepreneurs are willing to pay what they assume is a presumptive value of how much that economic resource is worth annually. Of course, what the crown is trying to do here to a certain extent is to inflate these annual concessions fees as much as possible, whereas the entrepreneur is trying to achieve the exact opposite, to pay as little as possible. And the crown welcomes this very much because these influxes of revenue that enter the so-called sort of public coffers to a certain extent are not tied in with the fluctuations of the economic activities in question. So this is useful because it allows the crown to be able to, when they're planning out the expenditures for a certain year, they know that there's a revenue of a certain amount that is going to be paid at a specific moment in a specific amount. So that facilitates when it comes to forecast how the royal budget will be applied. And this reminds me of an interesting thing. I'm going to open a little bit of a parenthesis, which is a topic that I think has not been discussed here, and I don't think it is often discussed even in the Spanish literature, but if I'm wrong, you guys can correct me, which is the fact that the Asiento de Negros also generated a renta. So when it came to, for the crown to borrow through consolidated debt instruments, there was a renta de esclavos negros that was used for the Spanish state, the Spanish monarchy, to finance itself. And as far as I know, or at least I have not read that much stuff about it, and I think it would be very interesting to see how the Spanish state is actually benefiting from the slave trade in this way. So we could actually make a very interesting connection between processes of state formation and empire building through the revenues that are generated by not the trading in slave per se, but the licensing of these trades, the creation of rents over that trade. Closing the parentheses and going back to my analysis. These contracts were also quite often used as a trade-off for provisioning contracts. So for example, every time there was a loan, which is actually a provisioning of credit in the end, or every time that the Navy or the armies, for example, needed certain goods, victuals, weaponry, clothing, victuals, quite often these operations, or not quite often, always, they needed to be serviced. They needed, the persons who were providing these services needed to be paid back. And quite often what the Crown does is actually to entrust revenue-yielding assets, such as these monopolies and these contracts, to these private entrepreneurs. I'm always reminded by the case of Grillo and Lomelin that you, Alejandro, have studied, in which essentially the Grillo and Lomelin were first, not foremost, but first builders of fleets, and then only later they became Asientistas de Negros, because the Asiento was a revenue-yielding asset that the Crown used precisely so that it could pay off for these shipwriters to build and operate this fleet. And finally, a last important reason why these type of leasing out mechanisms are quite common is what Antonio Espeña called double supervision, which is this principle that when you have contratadores, tax farmers on the one hand, but also the royal officials of the exchequer taking turns operating in the same area, they would actually keep an eye on each other, which we need to consider, because quite often just because there is a petty bureaucracy in place, quite often they have severe issues in terms of human capital, of being able to deal with issues of mercantile accounting, for example, and also issues of opportunism. Quite often, especially in these remote places in West Africa, there was a great tendency for some of the treasury officials to engage in embezzlement, in book tampering and whatnot. So the Crown believed that by alternating between direct administration and contracts, you would have these two groups sort of keeping an eye on each other. Now we put the shoe on the other foot. So if the Crown has an interest in leasing these monopolies and putting out these contracts, why would business elites, merchant bankers and whatnot, why would they be interested in operating these monopolistic contracts? On the one hand, because they provide above average rates of return compared to purely mercantile investments in the so-called private sector, such as trading. These contracts allow them to profit from a business that was based on entry barriers and anti-competitive privileges. That's the whole principle, for example, of licenses, right? For someone to engage in a certain trade, it needs to pay a fee in advance that automatically is unleveling the playing field. Also because there were all sorts of perks with these contracts. There were tax breaks and exemptions. For a start, if the asientista or the contratador wanted to trade in slaves, he could trade without having to pay for the licenses himself, which gave him an advantage over other slave traders who would have to acquire this trading permit. Then, of course, there were all sorts of political and symbolic gratifications awarded by the king. These contracts are usually framed within a rhetoric or a political culture concept of service to the king. It's not only about making them rich, but also that's how they frame it when they go to the public auctionings to negotiate the contracts. I'm doing this for the benefit of king and country, so to speak. And also, and this is also an extremely important aspect, especially in the case of slave trade, because this monitoring position over this activity gave them leeway to engage in illicit activities, such as smuggling or tax evasion. So, for example, by selling more licenses than they were allowed to according to their contracts, and other cases. So, when we move into the core period of my presentation, which is what I would call the sort of the mature period of the Portuguese contracts, from sort of the mid of the 16th century into the midway of the 17th century, 1640, The Portuguese public-private partnerships involving the Atlantic, Africa, and the transatlantic slave trade coalesced around 3 areas, each receiving its own contract. So we have Cape Verde and Guinea, that concerns the archipelago of the same name, but also the adjoining coast, so more or less from lower Senegambia into the upper Guinea coast, ending in Sierra Leone. We have São Tomé, which around this time starts to lose momentum and becomes a rather unimportant contract, and this is shown clearly in the sources by the fact that the contract is for decades without a recipient. It doesn't even appear on the sources. And this is directly linked to the ascension of the Angola contract that Miguel already told us about yesterday. Originally, São Tomé was covering the area that is under the purview of the Angola contract, which is more or less the coast of Congo and then south of Ndongo until Benguela. But the 2 areas were separated in 1579, and then a couple of years later, in 87, the first Angola contract was put out, and the ascent of this particular region eventually outshone São Tomé. And then Angola eventually would also outstrip Cape Verde and Guinea as the main extraction point for slaves on their way to the New World, as you probably know. So looking at these contracts per se, there are 3 main components to them. The first is tax farming, the second one is licensing, and then the third, and a little bit less important, but also worth mentioning, is a few additional estancos, so monopolies over tradable commodities. Because this needs to be explained. From the Portuguese vantage point in these contracts, slaves are themselves not a monopoly as a commodity, so to speak. Unlike iron, for example, unlike the urzela, which is a dye fungus, and a few other things. So going first to tax farming. So these contracts included, in the case of Cape Verde, essentially, at the first moment, taxes on local production of raw materials and foodstuffs within the different islands. So for every island, there was the right of the tax collector, a private tax collector, to collect these taxes on behalf of the crown. But then there were also the indirect taxes, which is where the slaving duties come into play. So I mentioned here a collection of different imports. So import-export, the dízimo, a 10% tax on that, the quartos and the vintenas on outfitting, so the dispatch of ships from Cape Verde to the adjoining coast, and the consulado, which is an ad valorem right of 3% on every good that comes and goes through the customs. Moving on to licensing, which is what we have discussed the most, I believe, so far. We have the so-called avança. We've talked a great deal about the licencias and the registros, which are the sort of analogous documents from the Spanish side that regulates the access of slaves coming from Africa into the Spanish-American market. But in the Portuguese case, there's a different type of legal document, legal permit, which is the avança. And Mark Eagle has made an article or a couple of publications where he explains quite clearly the difference between them and how it is important, because slave traders, especially slave traders who wanted to engage in illicit trades, selling more slaves than they were allowed to, played with these 2 documents. So there were different records in them, and they used the mismatch between the contents of these different permits to be allowed to smuggle more enslaved Africans than they were allowed. So as I said, the avança is actually a permission for an actual slave trader or for a voyage freighted out by a slave trader to actually sail to the West African coast, to these footholds where slaves were acquired and brought on board ships, for them to go there to trade and barter for enslaved Africans and for other goods. It also needs to be mentioned that this license was not only given in Lisbon or in Seville, wherever the contratador had offices, but thanks to Miguel Rodrigues' research, now it's quite clear that also people could also acquire an avança having reached the coast of West Africa, especially the case of Angola, since the contratadores didn't really have offices in the upper Guinea coast. I mean, they had in Cacheu, but the bureaucratic process is more advanced in the case of Angola. And then moving on, third, to the monopolies I mentioned, these are trade goods that are reserved for the contractor. Only the contractor himself can deal in these goods. As Linda Newsom explained this morning, the contratador of Cabo Verde and also Asientista, Antonio Fernandes de Elvas, gave permission for Manuel Batista Perez, I think it was Manuel Batista Perez, to actually be able to barter for enslaved Africans with iron, because this was a prerogative that was only his. And it's also important to bear in mind when it comes to the functioning of these contracts that the lump sum, so the leases, the concession fees that they paid for the right to operate these contracts, were paid in the Iberian Peninsula, but not only. They were also paid for in the actual districts of the contract. So in this case, in Western Africa itself, because there's this Portuguese originality for most of the early modern period, there is also actually tax agencies on the mainland of Africa. And the money that was deposited, that was paid for there, was used for the remuneration exactly of the public, for the royal officials, the administrative structures in place, so the military, the clergy, and civil officials. Their salaries were deducted from the monies paid by the contractor. And there, of course, also a handful of, as Manuel was telling us this morning, there was a handful of other extra payments. So for the pious works, the 1% fee for that, and a series also of grants that the king gave to someone. So for example, there was somebody, a member of the royal household, that was expected to receive every year 1 or 2 enslaved Africans for services that he had given the king at a certain point in the past. So it was up to the contratador to provide for these payments too. And going back to the avances for just a little bit, it was the responsibility of the factors of and correspondence of the contratadores in these different points of the West African coast to keep track, as well as the officials of the crown in this place, to keep track of the amount of avances that were sold and that were actually used for the purposes of trade in these places. This is an example. There should be more. Okay, well. Doesn't matter. So this is an example of the evolution of the prices of the concession fees for the different contracts that I combined with other monopolies and other tax farms of the Portuguese crown. This would be an interesting thing to, for example, overlap with the volumes of the transatlantic slave trade database, because of course the logic would dictate when volumes of trade are quite high, it would also mean that in principle the concession fees that businessmen are willing to pay would also be high. Of course, because illicit trade is rampant, quite often that is not the case, and there are some pretty impressive disparages in that regard. But this shows us, as I said, the evolutions of the prices of these leases. We can perhaps discuss these a little bit later. So we finally get to the moment, of course, when the Portuguese contratos overlap with the Asiento. And why was this the case? I mean, we all know this story quite well. When Portugal is aggregated into the Hispanic monarchy, just because it joins the monarchy, all of a sudden, it's not like there is a centrally coordinated policy in terms of regulating the Iberian slave trade. You still have different institutions in the different kingdoms regulating the different aspects of the trade. So the Portuguese crown continued through its institutions based in Lisbon, essentially the Conselho da Fazenda, the Exchequer Council, the Council of Government, and the Council of Portugal at the court, continued to have the purview, continued to have jurisdiction over the awarding of these tax farming monopolies. Even if, of course, Castilian institutions or the Junta de Negros, of course, would have something to say and would have an interest in trying to monitor and trying to steer policy in that regard. But for all intents and purposes, every time a Portuguese contrato was going to be put out, these were the institutions who were in charge of advertising, collecting bids, and then negotiating the terms and deciding who the recipient would become. And for the standpoint of Spanish traders, Castilian traders, and other traders from other Hispanic kingdoms, and for the Castilian and crown and the Hispanic monarchy, while there was, of course, as I said, there was certainly an evolution, an important one, which needs to be accounted for, which is, although there was this separation, it must be said that now they did not have to rely on subjects of foreign rulers, who could be enemy rulers, or rulers towards whom there was suspicion and there was rivalry, for the provision of slaves and for access to regions where enslaved individuals could be acquired. The Portuguese were now subjects of the same king. So there was a greater possibility for understanding and for a certain amount of coordination between the two. Of course, this policy, this type of understanding between Portuguese and Castilian and other agents operating in Spain was already happening before, as we have mentioned several times during these 2 days. As I said, before 1595, before the Asiento de Negros is created, there were already partnerships between Portuguese individuals, Portuguese contratadores, and Spanish merchants or merchants operating from Spain precisely for the purpose of allowing for enslaved individuals to reach the Spanish-American markets. And also there was this attempt of allocating certain amounts of trade permits to the Portuguese contratadores to send these slaves to Spanish America alongside with Brazil, which, of course, also needs to be stated, lacked a type of provisioning monopolistic contract of the sort that Spanish American have. And in the case of these arrangements where the contratadores were allowed to send 1/3 or 1/4 of all licencias as slaves to Spanish America, what would happen was that a quarter of the proceeds that the contratadores would make would be paid to the Spanish treasury. So how precisely did these two forms of government outsourcing interact? The Asiento of the Castilian crown and the contracts of the Portuguese crown. Well, this you know quite well, which is the Asiento does not precisely state in its terms and conditions where and how enslaved individuals will be procured in West Africa. And the answer to this lies in the avença, lies in the licenses that the contratadores can provide, and which allow Iberian merchants to go to the Portuguese domains in West Africa to acquire slaves. So as I said before, we have two different permits and two different sets of taxation that were put out by two different crowns, but they integrated themselves quite neatly. Another option was, of course, to combine them in the hands of the same partnership, of the same contratador and asentista. But actually, this was only attempted twice during the period of the Iberian Union. During the tenure of the Coutinho brothers at the helm of the Asiento, who were both contratadores of Angola and asentistas de negros, and the most spectacular and perhaps most famous case is that of António Fernandes de Alves, who was contratador of Cabo Verde, contratador of Angola, asentista de negros, and even tried to become the contratador of São Tomé, the old and seemingly long-forgotten contract of São Tomé, but he didn't get it. Had he done so, he would have completely controlled at least the legal setup of the transatlantic slave trade. But the crown at the time didn't find it suitable to give one single set of individuals control over the entire legal edifice of the slave trade. Of course, what I find interesting, and this is an aspect that I haven't felt that has been completely clarified in the literature, is actually the interaction between the contratadores and the asentistas when you had different groups of people running these two respective monopolies. So how was the interaction between them from a bureaucratic standpoint, from an aspect of coordination of the respective businesses, when there was a contratador for São Tomé, one for Angola, and then a different asentista de negros? What was the coexistence? How was some sort of harmony created between them? I think you guys know this part, so I'll just probably skip ahead. As far as the Asiento, everyone here is pretty much a specialist. You guys know more than me about it. I'm just going to stop here because one of the aspects where the two contracts are different from one another, of course, one of them being the right to sell licenses to acquire slaves in West Africa, and the other one contract that allows the recipient to issue license to insert slaves in a consumer market, is that while there was this contract in Spanish America, in Portuguese America it did not exist, with one exception that I will mention next. In Brazil, slaves were traded in a much more open, much more sort of liberal, multifaceted way that was not based on staple ports, and it was not based on the issuing of sort of monopolistic licenses. It was a much more free-flowing system, as we know, for example, from the case of the sugar trade, which Christopher Ebert has described along these lines in an extremely convincing manner in an exciting book that he published a few years ago. And even, for example, when monopolies were introduced for the Brazil trade, and of course, one of the cases where monopolies existed is the Brazil wood that comes already from the 16th century. But when the Companhia Geral do Comércio do Brasil was created in 1649, and it was given for monopolies as a trade-off for the outfitting of a military fleet that would escort the merchant ships to Brazil and back during the wars against the WIC, none of these forged tancos ever included a monopoly over licensing of slave trade voyages or over the transport of those very same slaves. It focused mainly on essential commodities, bread-making cereals, olive oil, wine, and salted cod, as well as the Brazil wood. The first attempt of creating something similar to the Asiento de Negros in the Portuguese Empire was the so-called Assento do Aprovisionamento do Maranhão. So a contract for the northeastern part of Brazil, which is considered for all intents and purposes as a separate administrative entity. So in between the 1670s and the 1700s, there were several ad hoc one-time contracts made with Lisbon merchants to bring a specific number of African captives, of enslaved individuals, men, women, and infants, to this region at a predetermined per capita price. So there was a certain amount of peças, either of Guinea and of Angola, that would be sent to this region, and the prices were agreed in advance. The purpose here was to ensure a steady stream of labor supply to this region, which was rather unexplored economically. There was a lot of economic potential that was untapped and could be further developed, but for that, there needed to be labor supply, a worker force at ready use. And also, the purpose was equally to create a stream of revenue that the Crown could use to build a defensive system of forts, of infantry regiments, an artillery system that could be used to defend the region against potential attacks by enemies, attempts of conquest. And the contract stipulated that these different sociedades, these different companies, would ensure the provisioning of the slaves themselves. So we don't have a case of a licensing enterprise where the holder of the contract is not himself per se a mover of enslaved individuals, but is just someone who benefits from managing a rent, from allowing third parties the right to themselves move and sell these enslaved individuals. And here are a few examples of some of these holders of these contracts to provision the slaving estanco of Maranhão. Some of them are people who have connections to the Upper Guinea coast, which makes a lot of sense given the geographic proximity between the two regions, at least in terms of latitude, but also people that have connections to the West Central African part of the Atlantic, such as Josephus Ardovicus, or actually Joseph Hardwick, which is, I believe, an Englishman who was himself a contratador of Angola around this time. So what we see is a sort of movement, which is confirmed when we look at the people who actually ran this estanco in the subsequent periods, people like Manuel Preto Valdez. This is the people from the Cacheu Company. So what we have is the same push we see during the Asiento de Negros, during Portugal's membership of the Iberian Union, which is for these big capitalists to try to control both the areas of extraction and also the Spanish or the American markets where the slaves would be subsequently sold. So we see this sort of trend replicating itself in Maranhão. Oh, this slide is out of order. I'm sorry for that. Stuart, how long do I still have? I'm not keeping track. Well, I'll just continue then. Of course, within this model, there are slight variations, so I wanted to talk a little bit about them, so to give an idea that this is not a fixed model. It's subject to different variations. The Iberians, as we know, are extremely creative when it comes to create these sort of monopolistic contracts and changing them and adapting them. And one of the interesting ones specifically concerns Angola, even though this is a model that is replicated quite often, particularly in the Indian Ocean maritime world, both in Mozambique and elsewhere in the Estado da Índia, which is to involve holders of top public posts, to put it this way, such as captains of forts or even governors, so the highest civil military authority in a given place, as being the custodian of leasing holding contracts or provisioning monopolies. So a case in point from early in the 16th century is this case of Fernão de Melo. This case is captain of the island of São Tomé, which has given himself a provisioning contract to bring enslaved individuals from the coast of Benin to Elmina, right? So this allowed the Crown to be able to appoint, to find suitable appointees, people of quality, so to speak, with high social capital, people with economic resources, because the fact is that quite often these posts require people to bring their own financial networks, their own economic networks, in order to revitalize the economic activities in these outposts. And to make these posts attractive, it gave them these extremely valuable concessions, which quite often work to the detriment of the populations and the people who pursued economic activities. The fact that he had the monopoly on the supplying of slaves probably did not work necessarily to the benefit of gold extraction, the golden trade in this area, but stuffed the pockets of this captain. And we see this example taken to great heights in the case of the Coutinho brothers in Angola at the very start of the 17th centuries, when João Rodrigues Coutinho was not only the Ascientista de Negros and the Contratador, he was himself the governor, and he was not only the governor, he was the government of Conquista. So this is when the Portuguese had these sort of Cortés, Pizarro-like ideas of enter the hinterland of Central West Africa, subdue the rulers of Congo and Ndongo, and find the fabled mines that existed in the heartland of present-day Angola. So there was an individual that had control over not only the regulated parts of the slave trades, but equally over, to put it in very crude, very bad economic terms, over the production of an enslaved labor force by virtue of these raidings that he conducted in the hinterlands. Slaves did not have to be acquired through the traditional fairs that convened in the hinterlands of Central West Africa. Through these raidings, he generated prisoners of war that then could be sent to the coast and then put on the ships of vencedores and holders of licencias. So this gave them an unprecedented control over the trade. And this was done because this was an individual with extensive experience operating in African theaters of war, because this was an individual from, of nobility, secondary nobility, but of nobility nonetheless, and an individual that was not afraid to come to Africa and die of the fevers. This is why Habsburg monarchs decided to give him this, this quite extensive set of privileges. Another originality of the contracts of Angola happens in the second half of the, or even before the second half of the 17th century, which is the fact that until that point, the profile of the contractors were, most of them, metropolitan merchants. So people who were operating from Seville, from Madrid, from the court, or from Lisbon. But now, because of the peculiar circumstances in which Angola found itself at this point, being under the yoke of the WIC, we have this really bizarre thing. I've read this in the secondary literature, and maybe this is a mistake, but apparently the first contract post the dual monarchy is actually leased in Angola while the Dutch are in control of Luanda. And I find this extremely interesting. But for the remaining years to come, the contract is actually advertised and given not in Lisbon, but in Luanda. So to the Luso-African elites, for the most part to the captains of the presidios, of the military forts that the Portuguese had around the main rivers that ensure the connections between the coast and the hinterland, namely to one particular family of the captains of Massangano, the Fonsecas. So we have people called João Teixeira da Fonseca and others who all come from the same family, and they have the contract consecutively for a period of 30-something years. And we know very little about who these individuals were. I myself don't, and I find this case fascinating because it's a complete break from the profile of the previous contratadores that came before. And at a certain point, we know that the scion of the family actually moves from Angola to Lisbon. So when the contracts are again advertised in Lisbon, these individuals, well, okay, it's no longer advertised in Lisbon, we lost the contracts. No, these people actually send someone to reside in Lisbon, and they continue to receive the contracts time and time again. And they start to bring in these partners, these co-recipients of the contract, such as that English merchant I mentioned, this sort of Joseph Hardwick. And to finish off, the other interesting peculiarity of the Angola contracts during this period is that they are now not only a contract for the levying of slaving duties and other taxes along the coast, or the issuing of trade permits for slaving ships to come to Central West Africa to barter slaves and then take them to the Americas. Now there is a very explicit connection, which is of course implicit before, but now it's fully fleshed out, with the militarization of the conquista of Angola. So this is the period post the reconquest of Luanda by Salvador Correia de Sá. So this is the apex of Portuguese attempts to expand militarily into the Angolan hinterland. And that change is quite visible in the contract. So we start to actually have clauses that state correctly, we give the licensing and the tax farming as a trade-off for the contratadores to send their people up north to the Luango coast to obtain rafia cloths, so what is called in the economy of Luanda the mau dinheiro. So as Miguel was explaining yesterday, this is a very little monetized economy, and the two main monetary units are piezas, so enslaved individuals, as appalling as that is, and also these textiles. So the infantry that was fighting in these sort of Angolan theaters of war, part of their remuneration was done through these rafia cloths. So actually what it's doing is that the Crown is outsourcing the logistics of paying for these armies who are conducting these wars in the Angolan hinterland. This is something we don't ever see in the Cape Verde case. It's a particularity of the Angola case, which now finally, especially thanks to Miguel's research, is being given full credit. And I reach my conclusions. I'll just summarize a few bullet points. As I said, the Iberian crowns were extremely creative when it came to outsource public utility tasks and revenue-yielding assets to private entities. These contracts entailed the outsourcing of whole areas, so stretches of the West African coast, but also commodities, the trade of these commodities. And these were either licensed out or they were leased out and contract out to specific merchant bankers. These contracts also, as I said, they preceded, they paralleled, they interacted, they crossed, but also they outlasted, they moved in opposite direction from the Asiento de Negros. They are very organizational complex, very costly, but also very potentially enriching endeavors. And final, it needs to be acknowledged that the contratadores and the ascentistas were gainers, were enablers of the transatlantic slave trade. And this role needs to be further acknowledged. Even though they themselves were not full-time merchants themselves, they were indirect gainers from this abhorrent economic activity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, Edgar.
Thank you, sir.
Our next presentation will be Olavide.
Muchas gracias a los organizadores por organizar este congreso. Me siento contento de participar en este evento y presentar mi trabajo sobre el mundo cultural complejo al que contribuyó los 600 esclavos. Ahora voy a hablar en inglés porque me es más fácil y no quiero aburrir a nadie con mi español lento. And it's also easier for me to present in English. So without further ado, let's get started. In 1685, on the 15th of November, a scribe at the House of Trade in Cadiz registered the Santa Elida and its captain and administrator, Enrique Enriquez, as a Coiman slave ship destined for the Guinea coast, and from there to Cartagena de Indias. This unusually large 377-ton urca had a multinational 108-man crew, along with a German infantry unit of 41 soldiers requested by the governor of Cartagena, Juan de Estrada. The Council of War and Finance also apparently had requested that the Council of the Indies contract the Santa Elida to dispatch provisions, including munitions, and to transport 300 Spanish sailors to Cartagena for the Armada de Indias, scheduled to leave later that year. The Santa Elida was registered as a slave ship, operating under the slave asiento of the Dutch financier, Balthasar Coimans. Coimans, as we have seen in earlier presentations today, was a sign of the Coimans trading house in the Dutch Republic, who lived in Cadiz as head of its Spanish branch and as a liaison for the Dutch West India Company, which had been subcontracted by the successive holders of the slave asiento since 1662 to transport slaves to Spanish America from Dutch factories on the Guinea coast through their colony on the Caribbean island of Curacao. In 1683, Coiman successfully worked to take over the administration of the slave asiento from Nicolas Porcio, and in a 1685 contract, was charged to deliver 3,000 slaves annually to Veracruz, Cartagena, or Portobello. Coimans held the asiento until death in 1686, after which his assistant, Jan Curacao, took over administration until he was jailed in 1688. Unlike previous contracts with the Dutch, Coymans was permitted to send 2 slave ships directly to Spanish American ports each year instead of delivering their slaves first to Curacao. Theoretically, this was meant to expedite the delivery of slaves. The Santa Elida, as one of these as one of 2 of these direct voyages sent in 1685, offers a case study into the way that Coyman slave ship financiers, captains, and crew members took advantage of this provision to engage in contraband and to expand extra-legal trading routes in the Caribbean. Its story also offers a glimpse into the anxieties of Spanish royal authorities and the ambitions of lower-ranking officials and local Caribbean merchants. Moreover, it demonstrates the entanglement of the early modern Atlantic world through the composition of its crew and its non-linear voyage from Europe to the Caribbean. Mark Eagle and David Wheat, in this wonderful collection, whose organizers are here at the conference, some of the organizers, have demonstrated that slaving voyages in the 16th century Iberian Atlantic were undertaken by ships that were not usually built for the sole purpose of trading slaves. Early Iberian transatlantic slave voyages carried passengers and material goods alongside slaves and often made unregistered stops along the way. The composition of ship crews were also diverse during the early period, even though Asiento contracts and slave licenses were held mostly by Portuguese contractors until 1640. Although the Santa Elida was given Spanish flags to fly during the voyage, its crew was composed of a mix of northern and southern Netherlanders, along with a handful of Germans, Italians, Spaniards, and even a man from Curacao and one from the East Indies. Its captain, moreover, was a Portuguese Jew with ties to the Spanish royal resident in Amsterdam, Manuel Belmont, and his liaison in Curacao, Francisco Lopez, who used the alias Moshe Lopez Enriquez in the Portuguese Jewish communities of Amsterdam and Curacao that all 3 were a part of. It would appear then that the Santa Elida represented a continuation of pre-1640 practices, suggesting that the slave trade remained a multicultural and multi-religious affair, a trans-European institution rather than one dominated solely by one national entity or another. At a glance, the officials of the Organización in Cádiz seem to take great care to record who was on the Santa Elida when it registered its voyage in 1685. Coyman's assistant, Jan Carcel, was called in as an interpreter for the declaration of the names of each man on board, along with their fathers, declared places of origin, and ages. The scribes also took great care to record the physical features of each man, which was a form of physical identification that royal officials used to try, and I emphasize try here, to control the movement of people across the Atlantic. The level of detail in these records offers a rare glimpse into the demographic makeup of the men who undertook these voyages. As can be seen in the graphs and charts on screen, most of the crew of the Santa Elida came from Amsterdam. However, a significant number came from other key ports of the Dutch Republic, particularly Middelburg and Flushing in Zeeland and Haarlem in Holland. Many crew members also came from Leiden, The Hague, Hoorn, and Rotterdam, along with other Holland and Zeeland towns. It's difficult to deduct some of the Hispanicized names, but it is clear that much of the crew came from smaller Holland and Zeeland towns. It's also interesting to find 9 men from Flanders and Brabant in the Netherlands, suggesting that the border between the northern and southern Netherlands was permeable in the late 17th century. Just as interesting is that 19 of the 41 soldiers destined to serve and reside in Cartagena were Dutch men from the United Provinces. Most of the men were between the ages of 20 and 35, with the majority being in the 20 to 25 age range. The captain and administrator himself, Rick Enriquez, was recorded as being only 24 years old at the time of the voyage was registered, which was a year older than the age of majority in the Netherlands. Apparently, some men served on Atlantic voyages into their 50s, like the lieutenant of the Santa Elida, Juan Jacobo Balaf, it's curious that the 300 Spanish sailors were not recorded in detail, suggesting that officials felt they did not need to track their movement as much as what they considered to be the foreign crew. While most of the crew was white, the cook, Correa, from the East Indies was described as Juan Negro of Flanders was also, I'm sorry, the second pilot, Juan Negro of Middelburg, also seems to have been of African descent, as was one of the soldiers, Antonio Negro of Flanders. Among the crew, there was also an Italian sailor, Esteban Copello, and one German sailor named Tomas Suarez from Augsburg. The name Suarez is clearly not of German origin and leads to the question of how these crew members presented themselves or of how they were perceived based on where officials making the records associated them with. A number of crew members from the Low Countries, for example, have apparently Iberian names, like Lorenzo Francisco from Rotterdam, Rodrigo Lorenzo from Haarlem, Suarez Andres from The Hague, and Bernardo de la Rivera of Amsterdam. More curious is a number of men listed as sailors from Holland, record names like Pablo, Pedro, Pedro, or Andres, hijo de Andres. This makes one wonder whether some of these names were actually aliases that either the scribe or Jan Kersau recorded without much care as to their veracity. Considering that the Santa Elida was later found to have carried private passengers between Veracruz and La Guaira in Venezuela, and between Curacao and Spain, it's not too far-fetched that some of these sailors might have been passengers that the ship picked up at some point in their journey from Rotterdam to Cadiz. It's also possible that the official did not take as much care to record all the details of each crew member as faithfully as the record initially suggests. Alternatively, Jan Kersau could have purposefully mistranslated names, or officials could have been bribed to overlook certain details of the crew. All of these scenarios are plausible, considering that the Santa Elida already arrived in Cadiz with illegal cargo that the ship's owners insisted be sold in Cartagena as part of their deal to lease the ship for the voyage. The captain and lieutenant, moreover, had sent word to Baltasar Coimans to purchase wine and olive oil for them to load in Cadiz to sell on their voyage. They apparently never loaded that cargo since they somehow managed to purchase their own merchandise when they arrived in Cadiz, which they later sold on board their ship in a public auction while waiting to dock and unload their shipment of slaves in the Bay of Cartagena. Getting at these stories and at the apparent dysfunction of the Coimans Asiento cannot be achieved only by looking at registro records. By expanding our scope of inquiry to include litigation in the Caribbean and report in the Netherlands, it also becomes clear that although the Coimans Asiento itself experienced operational issues, individuals involved in it were able to take advantage of loopholes that benefited their own personal financial interests. As Mark Eagle has demonstrated in this wonderful article, for slave voyages to Hispaniola during the Iberian Union period, avanzas, or permits granted in Lisbon, that my colleague just spoke about, for captains destined to West Africa, functioned as semi-private logbooks that reveal aspects of a slaving voyage that would be impossible to conduct from registros in Seville or Cadiz. Avanzas, or equivalent documents, are difficult to come by for slave traders in the later 17th century. However, on occasion, they do appear in the investigation of colonial administrators tasked with preventing contraband in the Spanish Indies. As the Dutch became more associated with contraband trade, colonial administrators became increasingly suspicious of Dutch ships working for Dutch Asiento holders. Indeed, the mystery behind the captain of Santa Elida, Enrique Enriquez, only unfolds when cross-referencing the registry of the voyage with an investigation carried out in December of 1687 by Fernando López de Ursino y Orbaneja, the alcalde del crimen of the Audiencia de México, 2 years after the Santa Elida was registered in Cadiz. After a coalition of Dutch, English, French pirates sacked Veracruz in 1683, tensions regarding foreign interlopers had been high in the port. Apparently, Enrique Enriquez decided to stay in the city for nearly 9 months, residing with the Asiento factor of Veracruz, Juan de la Cara. During this time, his large crew of 107 men frequented the city, even though foreign crews were not supposed to leave the island fortress of San Juan de Ulua while their ship docked there. This heightened the anxieties of royal officials, especially after rumors spread that the crew was involved in the escape of pirates imprisoned there. In the process of his investigation, Orbaneja discovered that the crew of the Santa Elida was indeed doing more than selling slaves in Veracruz. The investigator found that both the crew and Enriquez were selling a variety of unregistered goods to the city's residents, and they had hidden in the Santa Elida's hull. The investigator was also anxious about the relative freedom with which this Dutch crew accessed the city and wrote to the Council of the Indies regarding the license that the Santa Elida had to dock. The council replied that it had no record of issuing a slaving license for Veracruz to the Santa Elida, which brought a number of local officials there under investigation. This included the bailiff of the prison and the commander of the fortress on San Juan de Ulua, who permitted the Santa Elida to dock and allowed its crew to disembark in the first place. The Coimen's Asiento factor residing in Veracruz, who hosted Enriquez during his time there, also came under investigation since the Santa Elida was officially a Coimen slave ship. After it was discovered that the Santa Elida indeed did transport escaped pirates from the city's port, he eventually had to escape Veracruz to avoid arrest for collusion. Don Gaspar de Herrera, an alcalde ordinario actual of the local cabildo and vecino of Veracruz, was not in the city during the investigation, but was accused of maintaining regular business relationships with not only Enriquez, but also with a number of individuals in Curacao through him as a liaison. The investigation revealed that locals were traveling to Curacao to meet with the governor and director of the West India Company and there to broker trade deals. At the same time, Enriquez was apparently transporting both goods and passengers between Veracruz and La Guaira, the principal port of Caracas, via Curacao as a way station. This clandestine trade route allowed these two tobacco-producing regions to exchange resources, including slaves that they otherwise would have no access to. The investigation also found that the Santa Elida was offering passage to unregistered ports across the Atlantic. While in Veracruz, it had contracted voyages with a number of people, including the alcalde, Gaspar de Herrera, and 2 religious friars destined for Spain. The Santa Elida first took its passengers to Havana, where it engaged in further clandestine trade for a month and a half and picked up more passengers. From there, it sailed to Curacao, where it took on even more passengers brought to the island by 2 other Coimen slave ships, the San Antonio Abad from Havana and the Sesión from Caracas. On the 28th of May, 1687, the ship sailed from Curacao directly to Spain. The Coimen's Asiento leaked a number of cultural spaces. This is evident in the critical account that Pedro Van Bell published in 1689 of his experience with the Coimen's Asiento. Van Bell had a generally negative attitude toward Manuel Belmont in the text, possibly because he was Jewish and possibly because of his role as resident of the Spanish crown in the Netherlands. It's known that his in-law and associate Balthazar Beck hosted anti-Jewish attitudes in Curacao towards the Jewish community there too. It was in this context that he offered his harsh criticism of the Santa Elida's voyage in 1685 to 87, since it was contracted and funded by Belmont and Enrico Stats, who also hired their own captain to oversee the journey. As resident of the Spanish crown, Belmont created a bureaucracy that often included relatives or other Portuguese Jews. For example, shortly after becoming resident in 1679, he appointed 2 vice consuls in Rotterdam and Middelburg. This was Isaac Semachferro in Middelburg and Daniel de la Peña in Rotterdam, both of whom were relatives of Belmont and who themselves also sent members to represent the Curacao. Apart from Lopez Enriquez in Curacao, Belmont also unsuccessfully tried to send a relative to serve as the Asiento factor in Jamaica. During this time, there was a Portuguese Jew in the Netherlands named Josiao Gabay Ferro, who used the alias Enrique Enriquez, and sometimes the Dutch form, Hendrik Hendricks or Rick Hendricks, to trade with Spain and Spanish America, and was around the same age as the captain of the Santa Lida. Gabay Ferro was born in Spain to parents with Portuguese New Christian ancestry, but had relocated to the Dutch Republic, where he eventually converted to Judaism, possibly fully after this journey. Considering that Belmont hired Portuguese Jews with ties to Spain for his operations, it's very likely that the captain of the Santa Lida was this Enrique Enriquez, especially since Van Bell complained of his being an outsider and a money-hungry Rick. He used the same language to describe agents and Belmont himself. Although the Santa Lida represents one voyage between 1685 and 1687, it also demonstrates how the Asiento during this time created a space during the 1680s for private merchants to expand their own influence and wealth. The size of the Santa Lida allowed to carry an unusually large and diverse manifest. Apart from the 449 sailors and soldiers, it was also capable of holding around 1,000 slaves. Undoubtedly, such large ships were hired by the Coimen to demonstrate to royal officials that they were capable of fulfilling increasingly larger quotas for slave imports to Spanish America, while also offering other services. The Crown clearly saw an opportunity to commission the shipment of provisions for the galleon fleets, as well as royal correspondence for the Viceroy of Peru and a number of other royal officials, along with a case of medical books for the Holy Office in Cartagena. Furthermore, officials in Cádiz charged Enriquez and his mostly non-Catholic crew with holding mass on board for the 300 sailors being transported and loaded the Santa Lida with all the religious ornaments required to do so. It's doubtful that he carried this out or that officials actually expect him to do so. It seems rather that the Coimen's Asiento came to be seen by Spanish royal officials as an auxiliary for the increasingly unreliable Carrera system. Together with the continued use, let me show this page again. Together with the continued use of navios de registro, the Crown seemed to be content with relinquishing control over the movement of people and goods and information across the Atlantic for the sake of efficiency. This supports Carla Rand Phillips' 1987 theory that the relationship between political governance and economic growth was not necessarily linear, and that political actors were often reacting to economic realities more than shaping them. The world of the Santa Lida further demonstrates that the reform of transatlantic trade and transportation attributed to the Bourbons was already taking place under the rule of the later Habsburgs. When the Santa Lida arrived in Cartagena, it only reported bringing 600 slaves from the Guinea coast. The ship used the rest of the hold to carry its large cargo of contraband merchandise from the Netherlands and Spain, and probably from West Africa. After delivering its initial shipment to Cartagena, it arrived in Curacao on July 17, 1686, where the WIC director and governor sold Enriquez 900 slaves, specifically healthy young men known as piezas de Indias, for 190,000 pesos to take to Veracruz. Royal officials in Cartagena and Veracruz later wrote to the Council of the Indies and to the director of the WIC in Curacao, complaining of the scandal that Enriquez caused there by auctioning his own merchandise on board his ship before docking to disembark slaves. They reported their further shock that he would dare to demand payment for the slaves aboard his ship before agreeing to disembark them. Despite all this, the governor of Cartagena did receive his requested troops. The Armada provisions and reinforcements arrived long before the fleet itself did, and both Cartagena and Veracruz received a large ship of slaves, technically fulfilling the Santa Lida's Asiento quota, although not on paper. By the 1680s, the Spanish Empire depended on Dutch agents and networks to function. At the same time, Dutch outposts and colonies depended on Spanish markets to survive. This created a space whereby Jewish and Protestant individuals sought out trade relationships with Catholics. The transatlantic slave trade was therefore a catalyst for increasingly complex private trade enterprises that functioned across imperial borders. It came, however, at the cost of immense human suffering, as exponentially more African women, men, and children, whose stories are nearly invisible in records relating to the Santa Elida, suffered the fate of American slavery during the later 17th century. Thank you very much.
I guess we can open the session to discussions now.
Ramona Negron from Leiden University.
Hi, so I have a comment for Oren. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Obviously, we're working kind of the same subject, so I'm sure in the future we will talk more about this. I had a short comment. You mentioned the sailors on the ship, that they were, for instance, from the Netherlands, but had these Spanish names. I think that was very common, actually. What we see in the notarial archives of Amsterdam is, depending on the language the deed was written in, the names change. So, for instance, there can be a Johannes, which is a very common Dutch name, but when the deed is in Spanish, he all of a sudden becomes a Juan, or a Karel becomes Carlos or Charles. So I think that these people were just Dutchmen, especially considering that in the Asiento contract, Coimbras was actually allowed to have Dutch crews. So I guess just the fact that these sources you're looking at are in Spanish is kind of the reason why these people had Spanish names. So that was just a comment I had.
Miguel Geraldes? I don't know. What do you prefer the answer directly, or we collect some questions and after the answer? Stuart.
Yes, I'm. Mine is.
Sorry, we
Yes.
can hear
Should
you.
I go ahead, Manuel?
There is another question. There is Miguel, and
go?
there is 4 questions more.
So we collect questions first, okay?
Okay, Miguel.
My question is actually for Edgar. Thank you for your presentation, and I was intrigued when you mentioned the Brazilian companies, because I have not studied them personally. And first, when you mentioned that the Companhia Geral do Comércio do Brasil actually did not, between the 4 estanques that they had, they did not held the estanque for the supplying of slaves, which for me made perfect sense, because if you would start to actually interfere with the contract of Angola or even with the contract of Guinea, you would start to get into some problems with some important people. But then, afterwards, you said that unlike the Companhia Geral do Comércio do Brasil, the Companhia do Estanque of Maranhão actually got this special supply. And I was wondering if you know how this supplying actually worked, and if it worked at all, because the company, as far as I know, the Companhia do Estanque do Maranhão ended quite early in bankruptcy. So I was wondering if these people, the fact that they needed to supply slaves for the first time in an Asiento style of contract in the Portuguese Empire, if it interfered at all with their ability to make profits, or if it was just some trickery or some embezzlement from out of their own contractors. Thank you.
Thanks. There is Jorge and Iris, maybe in this direction. Okay. Well, I guess. Jorge Pedreira.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions to Edgar on his very interesting presentation. First, do you find any other benefits for the contractors other than material benefits? Are these entangled with intangible benefits such as honorary distinctions or not? Second question, have you found evidence of the possibility of a renewal of contracts outside auctions? If this is linked to any other services of the contractors to the Crown. If the Crown uses the contractors for instance, loans, that may justify the possibility of a renewal of the contracts outside the auctions. And third, do you have a notion of the profitability of the contracts, and if this in a way is linked to the sum that the Crown demands for contracting these services? Thank you.
Iris? Yes. Iris Cantor.
I'm laughing because I would like to make the same questions of Jorge. But I will aggregate some new point, historiographical point. How, after your, well, first of all, I congratulate all the participants of the table, but my question is to Edgar also. What about the text of Vitorino Magalhães Godinho, Finanças Públicas? After your research, you can reframe his conclusions about the role of the alfândegas in the support of the nobreza of the crown and the nobles in Portugal. So the links between, you know, the asiento in the contracto, in the building of the state, dynastic state.
Okay, there is no more questions, so I don't know. Stuart, maybe you want to
I have
make some confidence. Okay, please, it's yours. Please, Stuart.
Manuel?
Yes, you can speak. You can.
Yeah, all right.
There's no more questions.
Yes,
here.
I wanted to make a comment about Oren's presentation. I believe that this will come up in the next session in the roundtable when there'll be a discussion of the creation of the modern world in the Caribbean as a result of the Asiento. But I think that the inclusion of the tripulación and the study of the participants in the Asiento trade itself is a very important one. And there is information from the Inquisition about some of these people because of the mixture of religions that was taking place out of the Asiento. And so there's an interesting question here, an aspect about the way in which the Asiento was bringing across the empires contact to people, especially in the Caribbean region by the 18th century. A number of years ago, I published a book in which I ran across some of these people participating in the Asiento trade. And one of them, a man named Abuja from Asturias, eventually is taken and has books that he has acquired from the trade of contraband and from the Asiento contact. He has been to Carolina, to the Bahamas, and has bought some books, including a Bible in Spanish, written in Spanish, which of course was prohibited. and he purchased it from a Judío named Moises Brandon in Barbados. This is obviously a man named Brandão. And then a companion denounces him in Cartagena to the Inquisition, and he's tried in Cartagena and says that he's just interested in reading the Bible for himself. He's sent back to Seville, but 3 days out of port from Cartagena, the boat that he's on is taken by the English, and he ends up in Jamaica, where he gets married and then and has his children baptized in the Anglican Church, and then begins to serve in for contraband on the coast of Venezuela. And he's arrested in Trinidad, where he's recognized, sent back to Cartagena, and then tried as a relapso at that point. And he's really a product of the Asiento trade and the contraband trade that's going on alongside it across the empires, with contacts in Curacao, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and even Carolina. And I think that there's more that can be done with this aspect of the Asiento as part of a kind of general opening of the imperial mercantilist closures in the 18th century as a different kind of society results out of as a growth out of the Asiento trade.
Excellent. If you, podemos pasarle la palabra a todos los panelistas, empezando por bueno, a Edmond también se le ha hecho una pregunta, me parece que no, ¿no? Entonces, Edgar, si te parece, contestas.
Muy bien.
Pensad que tenemos que ser lo más puntuales posibles para la mesa redonda, ¿eh? Así que intentad ser breves, ¿vale?
I'll make a real effort to be as quick and to the point as I can. So, your question, Miguel, about Maranhão and the Estanco. First, there is indeed a company or several companies, but before the companies, there are the contract for provisioning is awarded also to partnerships of merchants. So I did not go into the Estanco as run by the corporate entity in my paper, but of course at some point they do appear. I think the company of Castillo themselves get it at some point. And as you said, from what I've seen from the literature, and this is an area where I'm only now starting to do more research on, like slowly, it seems that the outcome was not very favorable. Actually, what I've read in the literature says that contracts are negotiated and actually nowhere near the amount of enslaved individuals is delivered, and actually these enterprises never actually get to take off. But this is a preliminary statement. I would have to read more. I'm sure some of our colleagues in Brazil, namely, know a lot more about this than I do at this juncture. So answering your question, yes, it seems that the outcomes were not as successful as the Crown might have hoped. Now going on to Jorge's questions, which are all of them extremely to the point and extremely relevant. As far as the honorific grants, yes, certainly so. The contractors, when they were applying for these contracts, they themselves presented themselves as doing something for the benefit of the Crown and the country, of course, and some of them were indeed awarded with honorific grants. Of course, they were not granted usually at the start of their contracting careers. The Crown rewarded a more long-term, more systematic engagement, and obviously more politically important contracts came with more attractive social grants, patents of of knighthoods of the royal house, of course, habitus of the military orders, commendas more rarely. I mean, what Fernando Olival, for example, has studied quite clearly. That's certainly the case. Regarding the contracts that are awarded not through competitive tendering, I would say that the phenomena is not as prevalent as in the late 18th century, as you have studied, and Fernando Costa as well. So the expedient of these sort of automatic renewals of contracts in exchange for loans and financial services. I think I mean, I know of cases where that definitely happens, but it doesn't seem to be a practice that is as normalized, so to speak, as it will eventually become. What I find very interesting, and this is something that I have discussed with João Paulo Salvado, which is this idea of using these contracts as a trade-off or as collateral for a sort of loan or some sort of financial servicing. So in the end, a tax farming contract as collateral for an asiento de dinero, for one of these loans. And his point of view, João Paulo's, is that this is an Habsburg influence. This was something that was not very common before 1580. I'm not entirely sure if I buy into the argument or not, and he tells me that from his knowledge of the merchant elites in Lisbon at the turn of the 17th to the 18th century, and from your own research later on, that it doesn't seem to be as common. But at this point, I would have, as I hope to move into more recent chronologies, I would be able to provide a more definitive answer to that question. As far as the profitability of these enterprises, I didn't mention this topic because I was covering such different, as I'm going since the time of Henry the Navigator up to the turn of the 18th century. I mean, I did not go into the profitability of these contracts. But if we focus on the mature sort of Habsburg period contracts, I can refer to Miguel's PhD thesis where he actually went through the painstaking job of trying to calculate some of, at least the gross profits of some of these contracts for the Asiento de Negros. And what was the value that you ascertained? Let's see if I can remember. 45, 50%, right? Was no, right? Yeah, just something like that. And I know that Leonor Freire Costa has an article where she also attempts to calculate the gross profits, because that's what you can do, right? The difference between the concession fees and the money that you make from selling the licenses and collecting the taxes. Because when you start to take into account the other non-administrative expenses, just becomes, we just don't have the sources to do that for this period, unfortunately. But the conclusion would be, in a good year, way above what you would get in the in a purely private enterprise, which goes in line with your conclusions from your own studies. Yeah, I don't have a lot of new conclusions to give in that sense. And now moving into the last question that Iris asked me about Magalhães Godinho. No, I mean, my conclusions to a certain extent about the importance, especially of external trade and the customs in the sources of revenue of the Portuguese crown, I mean, they go in line with what he has concluded. If you looked at that graph that I showed that had the different tax farms, so to speak, you see that the customs, both the consulado and the actual farm of the customs of Lisbon, these are some of the highest revenues that the crown has that it farms out. Actually, in that regard, we could say that some of these West African public-private partnerships, this is a middle tier from the standpoint of the crown finances and the type of investments in the crown that merchant bankers can perform. This is a middle tier contract, which is, I think, actually my perception regarding the Asiento as well, the Asiento de Negros. A successful entrepreneur that operates it goes on to manage other types of rents. But it's worth what it's worth, this view. Thank you.
Oren.
Thank you very much, Stuart and Ramona. Both of your comments are excellent. I've actually thought about both of these comments a lot, and I can answer both in one shot since they are interrelated. Stuart, your book, All Can Be Saved, is absolutely in the background of this discussion and in my dissertation, which I'm currently completing, which is actually not on the Asiento. It's on the very entanglements that you pointed towards. I look at the entanglement of Portuguese Jews in the Dutch Atlantic with the Iberian world, and in that context, the Asiento is very much a vessel for these sort of interactions. You know, it's interesting that you brought up the Spanish Bible. I'm sure you're familiar with Isaac Aboab de Fonseca, in the rabbi in Amsterdam, which was part of the excommunication of Baruch Spinoza. He also published a Spanish language Bible for the purpose of attracting Portuguese and Spaniards arriving in the Netherlands to convert to Judaism, no matter the degree of new Christian ancestry that they had. So there are these, these things are happening, right? The connections are existing. I think also about Gregorio de Robles, who traveled around the Caribbean and in South America through networks of the Asiento. And I'm glad you brought up Inquisition records, because I do use those in my dissertation. And it's by looking at Inquisition records that I start to think about the stories behind the scribe, right? And this ties into Ramona's comment, right, about the names of the people on the ship. Right, and if we use the methodology of looking at Inquisition records, we can question what described it, and I very much agree with you that most of the names on the manifest were Hispanicized church names. And actually, I mean, there's 109 crew members, and out of them, only a handful I picked out as being as possibly being Spaniards. And I did that by using the same methodologies of questioning what might that scribe been intending, right? And a lot of it was looking at last names, a lot of it was places of origin, and a lot of it was looking at who came from port towns, right? Where there were multicultural groups, right? There were Spaniards and Portuguese in the Netherlands. But of course, right, I did emphasize in the talk that a lot of these names might have been aliases. And aliases are something that so far I've only seen, or mostly seen attributed to Portuguese Jews trading with the Spanish and Portuguese empires. As until now, I've only seen it referred to as a way to hide someone's religious identity. But the more and more I look at these records, I see that it's really most of the times they're used to mask economic connections and commercial relationships. And it's possible that people who are not Jewish, were Protestant or even Catholic, were trying to mask their identities to trade with these places. And that's why I picked out the names that were obviously strange, like Pablo's hijo de Pablo, right? It's hard to pick out who this person might have actually been. Of course, a lot more research needs to be done between the vast notarial records in Amsterdam and notarial records in the Spanish world, which is, I have not gotten that far yet, but I plan to keep looking into this past my dissertation, hopefully in the second project, or maybe collaboration with people like Ramona who are working in the Netherlands, who work mostly with the Portuguese Jewish community records and the Spanish records, of course. So I hope that answered some doubts that the both of you had or questions. I'll be happy to talk with you further, obviously not there, but maybe through email.
Stuart, you can close the session because we have to start the final one at 6:30, maybe 6:45, at least to have a break. Please, you have the floor, Stuart, to close.
So thank you all for attending. It's been an interesting experience to do this from larga distancia.
It's a bit complicated.
But it was a very interesting conference. I'm only sorry I can't be there on the Calle de Sierpes to enjoy Seville. But I miss it a great deal.
Thanks you very much.
Thank you.
Ciao.